Hi, I'm Carole Gibbs, and I'm here with Sally Simpson at the 28th annual meeting of the American Society of Criminology in Atlanta, Georgia. And I'm honored to have the opportunity to interview Sally, Professor of Criminology and Criminal Justice at the University of Maryland, College Park. So I'll just give a bit of background on her career, and then we'll jump into the questions. Sally received her bachelor's in sociology at Oregon State University, and her master's in sociology at Washington State University, and her PhD in sociology at the University of Massachusetts. She then began her career as a postdoc at the Harvard Business School before moving to a visiting position at Smith College, and then became an assistant professor at University of Oregon. Her move to University of Maryland has been permanent, and there she has served as graduate director, associate chair, and also as department chair for 9 years. Sally was also the president of the White Collar Crime Research Consortium and chair several times of the American Sociological Association's section on crime law and deviance. She has received many significant awards, so I'll just name a few today. The Herbert Bloch Award, and has been named an honorary fellow of the ASC. She's also received the Distinguished Scholar Award from the ASC Division on Women in Crime, the Gilgeist Lifetime Achievement Award from the National White Collar Crime Center and the White Collar Crime Research Consortium, and she also won the University of Maryland's Woman of the Year. But it's a particularly good time to interview Sally. She's been on a streak of late, won the 2017 Outstanding Article Award from the Division on White Collar and Corporate Crime, the 2018 Sutherland Award, and is soon to be, as of tomorrow, the president-elect
Yes.
Of the ASC. So it's an exciting time to be talking with Sally. So thank you for letting me in.
Thank you for the introduction, Carole.
So we'll start at the beginning. Tell us about the early life of Sally Simpson before academics.
How far back do you want me to go? Well, I do think that biography has a great deal of influence on how we navigate our path through life. So it is important that I did grow up on a farm in rural Eastern Oregon. My dad passed away when I was 2 months old, and my mother had 2 children. I was 2 months old, my sister was 2.5 years old, and my father had 2 children from a previous marriage whose mother had passed away. So these kids had no parents who were alive. So my one sister, Cindy, stayed with us while I was growing up, and my brother Guy went to live with his grandparents. But my mother ran the farm. She essentially managed it. She took care of things that they broke, and I kind of grew up with her as a role model that way. And one of the things that she always said to my sister and me was, you've got to get an education. Don't ever think that someone's going to take care of you. And with that in mind, I don't think she ever thought that sociology was going to pay off for me. But I went to Oregon State University and was maybe one of 10 people at Oregon State University that declared a major in sociology when I first got there. Of course, the University of Oregon was where most people went to study sociology, but I had a warm spot in my heart for Oregon State. A lot of my friends had gone there and family members, so I ended up going to Oregon State. And while I was there, I took a class in juvenile delinquency and a class in corrections within the Department of Sociology. And I also had this really great instructor, Mike Creighton, who taught sociological theory. And I think all of those things together meshed into a strong interest in delinquency and justice systems, as well as more of a sociological theoretical approach to the problem. And when I finished in my junior year, I wanted to get an internship, which is, I think, a smart thing for people to do. And there was a position in the juvenile detention center in Pendleton, Oregon. And I had that position for a summer, which was a really eye-opening experience for me. And I thought to myself, well, maybe this is the kind of work that I'd like to do. But I got credit for the internship, I graduated from Oregon State, and then I started looking for jobs, and it just wasn't much around. And I graduated a semester or a quarter early because I had finished the internship, and it was a 15-credit internship. So I thought, I need a master's degree to do what I wanted to do with my career. So I applied to one school, I think. I only applied to Washington State University because Jim Short was at Washington State University, and one of the few people whose names I recognized from my juvenile delinquency class. And so I ended up going to Washington State, and when I graduated from Washington State, I got a job in the state mental hospital working with emotionally disturbed adolescents. And the work was so intensive and so painful in many ways that I think it had a significant influence on how I thought about my career going forward. And it just so happened that about that same time, a former instructor of mine at Washington State University, who was a visiting instructor there, his name was Jerry Garrett, and he'd received his PhD from Washington State, but was teaching at UMass Boston, and was just there on a year-long teaching, visiting professorship. And I took his class while I was at Washington State. He was a great instructor, very, very engaging, and he taught a class on comparative criminal justice systems, where he compared the Nazi-era justice system in Germany to the American criminal justice system, and it was just fascinating. So I developed a friendship with him, and after I graduated, he said, "I'm developing these programs overseas, and we need some instructors. Would you like to come over and teach in this program that we have?" They had different campuses all over Europe because they were aimed toward military personnel continuing their degrees. So through that experience, I said, sure, of course, I'd love to do that. I had just taught at Gonzaga University after my stint in the state mental hospital, working with the emotionally disturbed adolescents. And I left Gonzaga, I went to Europe, and those two teaching experiences at Gonzaga, and I was in Spain, actually, at Torrejón de Ardoz. And those two experiences made me realize that I didn't really know enough to be teaching college classes, but I loved teaching. And so that's what turned me toward the PhD. And I applied to graduate school from the job in Spain and ended up at UMass Amherst.
So my takeaways were, when in doubt, get another degree.
Yes, yeah, very good. As my mother said, education, education, education.
You said that the time at the state mental hospital had a significant influence on how you approach things. Could you say more about that?
Well, one of the things that it made me realize was that there were a lot of young kids out there who had a lot of difficult issues that they were confronting. In fact, I had one young girl come and spend the weekend with me, and when she was out of the institution, and this was a full-bore mental institution, right, with the walls around it, and you had to have access to get in. And it made me realize that these kids just need so much more than what we were providing for them. And in a community like mine, which was rural town, not a lot of resources, it made me realize that we didn't do a very good job working with these kids. And I'll never forget, after I worked in juvenile detention, I had gotten very close to a young girl who had been in and out of detention, and I'll never forget, after I had stopped working, I found out in the fall that she had stepped in front of a car when she was walking along the road. So, and that's when I thought, oh, I don't know that I can do this kind of work. Yeah. It just takes so much out of you.
I had no idea so much of your early interest came from working in the system. because of where you've gone since then.
Yes, right. You wouldn't know that, but it did give me the experience to know that that wasn't something I was going to be well suited for.
So, from that point, when you applied for your PhD, who were the influences, or what were the turning points that brought you into your areas of interest now?
Well, when I was in Washington State, I did take a class from Jim Short, and when I thought of going back to graduate school, Jim Short was such a big name in the field, so he was a very influential person over anyone who was studying criminology. And Merv White, who was also there, taught the corrections class, and Merv was a very approachable person. And so I talked to Merv a little bit about what he thought, where I should go if I continued my education. And then Jerry Garrett, who had taught at UMass Boston, was also influential when I said, I think I'd like to, get out of the Pacific Northwest. There was a sense that you shouldn't do your master's degree and PhD at the same place. You get broader experiences, more exposure, back then anyway. And so I talked to Jerry, and he said, you should, don't apply to UMass Boston because it doesn't really have a PhD program. UMass Amherst, however, has a good PhD program and people who study crime. And one of the people there was Anthony R. Harris, Tony Harris. Mm-hmm. And so when I went to University of Massachusetts, one of the reasons I went was because of Tony. And I had come into contact with some of his work while I was finishing up at Washington State University. And so there was that kind of attraction. And he did really brilliant work. And he was interested in gender and crime. Mm. So that had a tremendous influence on the path that I took in terms of my interest in gender. I was always interested in stratification and power inequalities in society, and gender was just one more nuance of that stratification system. And so there I was at UMass Amherst working with Tony Harris.
So gender came first.
Well, it's very funny. I taught a class on gender and society when I was at Spokane teaching at Gonzaga, because I had written a paper for my corrections class on women's prisons. So I somehow became the expert on gender, and they wanted me to teach a class that was gender and society. So I, of course, they were bringing me in. I was temporary visiting for a semester. And so, okay, I'll teach this class. But that also precipitated the interest in gender.
Okay.
So yes, gender came before corporate crime.
And then what were the influences? What brought you into the corporate crime arena?
I read a book when I was at UMass Amherst. Pete Rossi had his students in his research methods class, which I did not take, but he had them reading Clinard and Yeager's Corporate Crime. And so I got my hands on
you read the book.
The book. I read the book, and I said to myself, I want to do this. And of course, I was familiar with Sutherland and Sutherland's work, which I thought was fascinating, but this was building on that. Mm-hmm. And also, I had a class at Washington State that was on complex organizations. And I thought that was a really fascinating class. And so that organizational interest, the focus on corporate crime, all came together, and I thought, here's my dissertation.
So
and that's what I did.
Yeah, you really had a chance to explore through that educational process that path that your mom set you on.
It sure did. Yeah. Yeah. Of course, by the time I was at UMass Amherst, my mother was saying, when are you going to be done?
That question always comes up.
And when are you going to have a real job?
Is there anything else on your background that you'd like to add to that?
I don't think so. I mean, it makes the kind of rural farm background makes you pretty independent.
Yeah.
You take care of yourself a lot, and I do think that affects the way you navigate your way through school, and it does give you some confidence, though, and I think that's important, especially for women. Being in an academic field at the time I was coming out, it was really important to have a little bit of self-confidence.
Yeah. I bet that will come up later in one of my other questions. But for the moment, could you describe the major themes of your work?
Well, when I had to do this for when I was coming up for tenure, I think that
those times when we actually stop to think about it.
Yes, exactly. I focused on the stratification issue, and I think that corporate crime is really about stratification and power, and different ways in which corporations and corporate offenders are processed compared to more traditional offenders. And because I was interested in stratification, the gender piece of it also, I wanted to understand women's experiences as why they committed crime, why did they commit crime in so fewer numbers compared to men, but they had very interesting offending patterns. And the theories did not do a very good job, as we know, of explaining why women offended. But the literature that was developing at the time when I was getting interested in gender and crime was really focused more around women's victimization. So, as I think Kathy Daly said back then, people find it hard to talk about female offenders because they're more focused around female victimization. Those are the two main themes that my research has taken. I've been interested in criminological theory, so of course theoretical explanations for why corporations offend, why women offend, and also the distribution of power and how it affects processing. So in both the case of the corporation and in the case of women.
I really appreciated in the introduction to you, to the Sutherland address, when Karen Heimer talked about the breadth of your view and the contributions that you've made to the field being something that distinguishes you. But I'm curious, what are your favorite things out of what you've done?
My favorite things that I have done. I would say that on the gender and crime side, the Women's Experience of Violence Project, where I had the opportunity to work with Julie Horney, Candace Critchnet, and Rosemary Gardner
Dream team.
Yes, the dream team. On a data collection effort focused around women's experiences of violence. And we collected data in Baltimore, at the Baltimore City Detention Center, in Toronto, and in Minnesota. So we had 3 different sites. We were, as you know, you were involved in that project. It was very intensive. I think we collected some wonderful data that was both qualitative and narrative as well as quantitative. We had static indicators, we had monthly indicators of women's experiences and how they changed over time. And I think that project brought a whole group of people together. And what made it enjoyable was the people who were involved and the feeling that we were doing something unique and important. So that was on that side. I would say on the corporate crime side, I've had a number of projects that I'm proud of in that area. And I think even my dissertation, because it was so hard to do, but it replicated the Sutherland approach and the Clinard and Yeager approach at integrating data from criminal, civil, and regulatory areas. I focused on anti-competitive behavior, so antitrust offending. And of course, Peter and Marshall Clinard focused on a wider variety of offenses, as did Sutherland. But I collected all the data myself and put it together and studied companies from 1927 through 1981 and looked at survivor companies over those times and across 7 basic manufacturing industries. And similar kinds of patterns emerged that emerged from Sutherland's work and that emerged from Peter and Marshall's work. And so I started to feel like my work was fitting into that body of literature that I found so important when I was first looking to find a dissertation topic. So I was very proud of that work. And then when I actually went to the University of Maryland and had the opportunity to work with doctoral students at Maryland, I had collected data for my dissertation that not only looked at patterns of offending, but responses to offending. And I had done no work on that side of things with the dissertation data. So when I got to Maryland, I started working with Chris Koper on what happened to these companies after they offended. And so Chris and I did some really, I thought, exciting work on predicting time to failure and testing deterrence theories, looking at company and managerial characteristics and product markets to see how those all affected offending patterns. So we published the first paper on corporate deterrence in Criminology, and then the other one in JQC on managerial characteristics and offending. But the piece, this is kind of a funny story because the editor of Criminology was Charles Tittle at the time. And so Chris and I submitted the article, and we got great feedback. I think we got an R&R, and we made the revisions, and it was accepted. But because Charles was a deterrence theorist, he thought what we were doing, and he was a perceptual deterrence theorist, right? So we were looking more at specific deterrence at the firm level. He said, you can't call that deterrence. So we had to put deterrence in quotation marks in the title, and when we used the term in the text, I said to Chris, this is really funny. Deterrence.
Yeah.
So
that's not too bad of a revision to get into criminology.
And so then I started working with Ray Paternoster, and Ray was the deterrence guy, very well published and very well respected. And so Ray and I started talking about what deterrence might look like if we tested it using vignettes. And we collected data. Lori Ellis and I, she was heavily involved in that. A friend of mine, Craig Smith, was at Georgetown University at the time, and so we collected data on people who were in MBA programs to use them rather than undergraduates who didn't have a lot of experience in business. And so we collected, I've collected actually 3 rounds of vignette data over the years, looking at not only what seems to increase the willingness to violate the law, but what factors seem to keep people from doing so. So we did a series of studies on that. Ray and I developed a rational choice theory of corporate crime, in which we struggled back and forth because Ray's thinking is very individual level, and my thinking was very sociological. And so we managed to talk about organizational influences and individual influences on individual behavior. So it was a great collaboration. He was wonderful to work with.
Yeah, you guys really created a complex model for the rest of us to now try to run with.
Yeah, and I'm doing some really interesting things now, trying to merge the gender focus with the corporate focus. And there's been a lot of work in the business literature that talks about, does it matter to have women managers? What's the impact of more women in management positions? And so I'm working with a couple of people in the business school, Christine Beckman and Deborah Shapiro, and Jerry Martin, who's at American University, to build another big database to look at the impact of women on the board of directors, to see whether that has a repressive effect on unethical behavior at the corporate level. So you see the theme. I mean, it started with antitrust. It's really Peter Yeager's fault. It's all Peter's fault. If I hadn't read that book.
I think he would accept that.
Yeah.
So how has your work or your major findings endured criticism?
Well, I actually think that people who work in the field of corporate crime understand the huge data problems that we confront. And therefore, we all get that there are data problems, and we are all very creative trying to work around those data problems. As you know, you work in the field. And so people are critical, but they are not, what else can you do?
Right.
I remember with the piece that Chris Koper and I published in JQC, one of the reviewers said, well, these data, they're really, official reports of data, and you have no way of knowing the funneling process and who gets in. And I remember being frustrated with, well, yes, what do you want us to do? Victimization surveys or self-reports of corporate offenders? Where are we going to get that kind of data? Mm-hmm. And I remember talking to Dan Nagan about it, and Dan goes, Sally, just say, this is what we've got. There's nothing else out there. And we recognize that it has its flaws, mm-hmm. but let's at least try to see what this tells us, right. What kind of picture these data tell us.
Right. And I think it's impressive what you've been able to do despite those data limitations.
Well, I will say this, I am so indebted to my students.
Yes.
Because, as you know, you do a lot of the heavy lifting. One more project I really would like to mention is the Campbell Systematic Review mm-hmm. that I did with Melissa Rory and Natalie Schell and Mariel Alper. We approached David Weisbird and people at the Campbell Collaboration and said, there's nothing out here on corporations. It's all focused around kind of traditional topics. And so in the course of the conversation, David said, well, yeah, why don't you see what you can do, pull something together. And we put together a proposal and said that we wanted to look at corporate deterrence, and submitted it to the Campbell Collaboration, and they said, okay, yeah, that's fine.
So it wasn't corporate deterrence anymore. It was actually corporate deterrence.
It was corporate deterrence. Yeah, it wasn't corporate deterrence. It was deterring, prevention and control of corporate crime. Anyway, and so that turned into a massive effort. As I said, I went through like 3 different graduate students mm-hmm. working on that project. Started with Natalie Schell, moved to Melissa, and then moved to Mariel Alpert at the end. But we uncovered massive literatures because, of course, as I said in my Sutherland address, it's the definitional problem. When you're doing a search of the literature, mm-hmm. which is required in a systematic review, what do you call it?
Yeah.
Corporate crime, occupational crime, business crime, the specific statutes that and so we had 64, I think, search terms that yielded tens of thousands of articles across all right, because business studies it, economics studies it, sociology studies it, criminology studies it. And so I remember we had a paper at one of the ASCs called, Why Did This Protocol Take 5 Years? And it took us about, I am not exaggerating, probably 7 years to get the results out. But I think the results were really important.
Thus the Outstanding Paper Award.
That was, yeah, it was, yeah.
So in the area of gender, what would you say about the sustained presence of your work in the field?
I'm not sure that I'm a very good judge of that. I would say that I think there are other people who have had a much more central role mm-hmm. in the field in those areas, and I think their work probably sustains longer and probably will have a longer impact. I think that maybe what Karen said in her introduction of me is that I have kind of a big picture mm-hmm. approach to it, and maybe my reviews that I have done, I did an annual review for sociology that was on actually corporate crime. Candace did the one on gender and crime, but I'm thinking that my approaches have tended to be where do we need to do work? Mm-hmm. Why do we need to do work in these areas? What does a gendered approach offer? Doing gender, trying new approaches that have emerged out of the feminist literature to see how good those approaches are at differentiating things, intersectionality, mm-hmm. for instance. So I think that I have maybe brought some ideas forward and maybe more into the mainstream by trying to test these theories or talking about them a little bit. But the work that I've done is, compared to the corporate crime stuff, is much smaller. It's a much smaller body of research. And you might be a better judge of how much influence it's had. I tend to think of people like Mita Chesney Lind and Kathy Daly and Betsy Stanko, people kind of who were originally involved in this kind of work. And then, there are lots and lots of young scholars doing excellent work in this area now.
Well, I like the way you described it as sort of that, bringing that broad perspective in and the links.
Yeah, because I am very interested in theory. And so one of the ways I think maybe my feminist scholarship has been influential is that I try to bring the new theoretical perspectives forward.
How would you like to see scholars build on your work?
I think that replication is not done enough. And I think especially in areas that are a little bit marginal to the main areas in criminology. And so I think replication with different populations is very, very important. I think that policy, perhaps in the area of corporate crime, is a place that I would like to see more work done. In the gender area, I do think that intersectionality and pathways are important approaches to thinking about gendered social organization, but also how in intersectionality it intersects with race and ethnicity and class and sexuality, and these are new areas that are, especially the sexuality piece of it, I think is really moving forward. A lot of my students are very interested in those particular issues.
So you as a scholar, what would you say are your identifying characteristics?
I'm an idea person. I have a lot of ideas, many of which one cannot do, but I think that I have a good sense maybe of what could be done and trying to move things forward where we've been and where we need to go. And so I think that's probably how I would describe myself, as more of an idea person. I read broadly out of the discipline. As a sociologist, I think that matters. I've been exposed to a lot of business literature, economic literature, because when you study antitrust, you have to read the economics literature. And I think sociologists are very, I'm a much more macro thinker. So that has, I'd say that probably characterizes my scholarship more than anything. Ideas and more of a macro focus.
I would add to that independence that you learned growing up.
I don't follow the crowd.
No, you don't, and there's a tenacity in that too, because it's challenging. A 7-year project.
Oh yes,
so,
it was more challenging for the students who were working on it.
I know your methods for keeping the students going, but you're keeping yourself going somehow too, which we'll talk about in a second. But in terms of your students or junior faculty, what's your mentoring philosophy?
Be human. I was not formally mentored, and mentoring came much further along. I was never mentored as a doctoral student. I was never mentored as a junior faculty. But mentoring kind of naturally occurs when you have good relationships with people. And so there are always people that you share a worldview, you share a personality, you are maybe similar in the way you approach your scholarship. And so there have always been people along the way that I could call them mentors, but they were never formal mentors for me. In each of the places that I've been, there was always someone that I could go and talk with. And I think for my students, I want to be open, I want to be, but I also want them to do what they need to do to be successful. So being human, being honest, and making sure that they're doing what they need to do to achieve their goals.
So if we can look at all of that together, how does who you are as a scholar and the way you approach mentoring influence your work as a whole? The research topics, how you interact with students, like sort of what your work looks like day to day. What is Sally's life like at work?
Well, I was one of these people who always went into the office, even in light of, I can work from home, I can telecommute. No, I was always there. In part because my work and my organization has been such a part of me. You know, that department, I've been there since 1989. And so the relationships that I had with people there were so important to me. So my husband often accused me of being more, you know, interested in work than interested in family. But that's because I felt like work was family to some extent. So my day-to-day is pretty much, I go in, I meet with people, I do what I need to do. Now I'm stuck with a computer and email most of the time, no time to do big thinking anymore. And you know, maybe after work go and, you know, get together with some colleagues and talk about the day and things that are important. So that's the life.
Yeah.
Maybe play some golf with them.
I can't tell any of your golf stories. That would not be appropriate here.
No. I did bond with Julie Horney over golf, though, when I met her.
So if you start to think back over your career, how have you sustained yourself and your enthusiasm for this work over time? And I was curious, since you're working in the corporate crime area predominantly, particularly in the last few years.
Well, it is a challenge, but the corporate crime area was always under-resourced, and you were always pretty much on your own, even before the last political election, I guess is what you're referring to, where corruption and ethics and no boundaries, you know, it just seems like I don't have a lot of empirical evidence on that. I haven't done a systematic study of it. That could be something to do in the future. But I do think that there was a period of time in the Obama administration when and maybe it's because Jim Lynch was at BJS and John Laub was at NIJ, that they took corporate crime, cybercrime, identity theft, those kinds of areas very seriously. I will say that there's always been a fair amount of support with VAWA and violence against women to do important work in that area. But the corporate crime area was pretty under-resourced. So I'm used to working in that environment. I felt flush for about a 4-year period, and then resources dried up again. And you know, maybe we'll get somebody in the next time that views corporate and white-collar crime as important. And I really have to say that I think that in this new world, in the digital environment, crime is changing. And a lot of what is going to be crime in the future is going to be white collar. It's going to involve computers. It's going to be a different kind of crime. And you already see businesses spending a lot of money on cybersecurity. And tell me one major university that does not have a center on cybersecurity, interdisciplinary center. And the engineers are starting to realize that they know a lot about hardware, but they don't know a lot about human behavior. And so you're seeing a lot more integration of the social sciences into these huge centers that are being built.
Makes me think about those definitions of white-collar crime conversations.
Yes, yes.
Your definition matters, Dr. Simpson.
Yes, definition matters.
Well, I believe it was during the Obama administration that you and Peter were working on a plan for a federal white-collar crime database.
Yes, it was Peter Yeager and I got a grant from the Bureau of Justice Statistics to explore the possibility of building a comprehensive database on corporate, on white-collar violations. And so Peter and I collected information from various regulatory agencies to look at the nature of the administrative data that was collected. We worked with people at BJS who had experience with the Federal Justice Database, the FJSP, which integrates data from the Marshal Service all the way through Bureau of Prisons. And they have civil data as well that is not cleaned yet, but they have data that we talked about. How can we integrate across regulatory data, the civil justice system, and the criminal justice system? We talked to a lot of people in these agencies themselves, people who had administrative data that might be relevant for building a database. And we submitted a very detailed report on that. But to undertake something like that, as I said in my talk on Tuesday night, there has to be political will, resources, and a group of people who agree these are the pieces to build into it. This is the way it needs to come out. And we never got the sense that there was any of that political will. And quite frankly, on the contrary, many agencies are concerned that their data might be used against them. So that if we share this with you, someone's going to say, oh, that's how you're using those resources? You shouldn't be getting this much money. You're not, they feel politically vulnerable. So Peter and I, after we finished the BJS grant, decided that maybe what we should do is try the political angle. Let's go talk to the politicians and see if we can get them to invest in something like this or put it as part of a bill. And we learned that Representative Conyers actually had a bill that he had submitted that required Congress to develop a corporate crime database. Always voted down. I don't even think it ever went out of a committee. And so we had the bill, we just didn't have the will. So I do think that it's going to take some combination of resources, someone with some political power and authority to say, we need to do this.
As you think back over your career, would you have done anything differently if you were beginning again? Or if you think about what kind of advice you would give to young scholars?
Well, I would probably have applied to a broader group of graduate schools when I went. I think I applied to one or two each time I applied. Of course, back then, information was not easily, readily available on all the programs that were out there and who was where and what kind of funding might be available. So one of the things I tell my students now is, look at the programs, look at them carefully, who's where you want to be, do they do the kind of work you're interested in. So I think I had a great educational experience, but of course I don't know what it might have been elsewhere, right? But I did have great mentors along the way, and I'm glad that I did the coast-to-coast thing because it did make me even more independent living on my own and that far away from family. You kind of have to carve out a life for yourself.
Yeah. I'm curious about your general thoughts on the intellectual or professional state of the field in general, but also what developments give you the most hope for the future?
I've had these conversations with some colleagues. John Laub and I actually had a conversation not too long ago about our concern that the field is becoming more insular. One of the things that I think made criminology and criminal justice such an exciting place to be initially was the interdisciplinary nature of it. And I think we're kind of losing that character a little bit. We're training a lot of our own students now who are going on and working in criminal justice and criminology and criminal justice programs, but they often are being not trained by psychologists or economists or sociologists. Sociology used to be the main source of people coming out with an interest in criminology and criminal justice. Sociology kind of kicked us out of the discipline to some extent. We were too applied from their points of view, I guess. And we had all the students, so we said, okay, we'll go, and we'll take all the students with us. So I am a little bit worried that people are not being trained, especially in theory, the way our generation of scholars were trained. And that makes them a little bit more narrow. It makes their creativity, I think, a little less. So I am worried about that. I would like the field to maintain that strong interdisciplinary nature. And as I said, I do think that as our society continues to change, cybercrime, white-collar crime, they are really going to be the center of what's the crime problem. And if we haven't really spent the resources and trained the students in those areas, look at cyber. There are so few people that are really trained to study that. You've got a lot of engineers, but you don't have a lot of criminologists who study cyber. And you don't have cyber programs at some of the top doctoral programs. Some of them are changing, but I really think that that's going to be where the field needs to be paying more attention. I think also there are particular important issues that are related to the globalization of crime. Human trafficking is a big issue that, again, we don't have a lot of data about it, but we know it's a problem. So the nature of global crime, global regulation, you've done some great work on trying to track things as they move from country to country and trying to intervene, policing strategies, interdiction strategies. I think the drug people have got a handle on this to some extent because they've been studying drugs as a global phenomenon, but I think so much more crime is global these days. So I think that's kind of where the field is going to have to be paying more attention. Modernizing the nation's crime statistics, which came out of the National Research Council, Jim Lynch and Janet Lawrenson worked on it, along with a lot of other people. I mean, one of the points that they make is that we're still measuring crime the way we measured crime in the 1930s, right? And so much of it has changed, and so many different types of crime have emerged. And because the global nature of crime as well, we don't have data systems that can communicate and share and talk with one another in other countries. And so breaking down those barriers, I think, is really going to be important in the future.
So, as you think back over our conversation, are there other things that you wanted to share that I haven't asked about?
You didn't ask about my administrative experiences. Well, I think that when people go into academia, they don't think about, I want to be an administrator. We want to do our research. We're excited about our topics. We want to work with students. And yet, I will say that it was a wonderful experience for me to be department chair at Maryland, because I learned so much more about the academy more broadly and understanding how decisions are made at all the various layers. And I think departments need to be led by people who have that understanding of the organization as a whole and where their discipline fits in. So I was glad when it was over, but I think that has also had an impact on the way I think about my work. As I said, I'm doing a project with people in the business school, in part because I think that they have unique perspectives, they have unique data, they have ways of thinking that are important for us to consider when we study something like corporate crime. We are interdisciplinary. We should be working with interdisciplinary scholars.
I feel like we've come full circle, because when I asked you about your favorite works, your eyes lit up when you talked about your dissertation and collecting your own data and being immersed in that.
Yeah.
And we've come all the way up to the administrative portion of your career, where you've stepped into that role to shape the field in a different way.
Yeah.
So I appreciate this. Thank you so much. You always share all of yourself with people, and I feel like you've done that here today. So thank you for giving me this time, and all of us this time.
Thank you, Carole. And thank you for being a great doctoral student.
I was going to ask who your favorite student was, but I took that question out.